Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 445 for September 8th, 2025. We've got a new show for you this week. As always, plenty of topics to consider. Frankly, there's so many news stories every week. I look at least 30 or 40 to evaluate for this show. And so obviously I only get to, maybe a dozen of those if I'm lucky. And it's really hard to pick, but I got to keep this show to about an hour. I usually go over a little bit, even with that. But just FYI, another perk of being a patron, particularly in this case, one of my top tier patrons, is I send out a list of all the candidate articles that everything I looked at, everything I evaluated for this show to be, to make the cut. And so basically it's a curated list of privacy and security stories every 2 weeks. So just another perk of being a patron, if that's something you're interested in. So if that's something that interests you, go to fdsd.me/patron. All right, one quick PSA here. I'm not going to really read a story about it, but if you have an Android device, you should definitely look for updates and get it updated as soon as possible. Google just released a patch for over 100 bugs in Android, 2 of which were pretty serious zero-day bugs that they believe were being actively exploited. So if you have a Google Pixel device, you've probably already gotten these updates. If you have a non-Google Android device, be on the lookout for updates. And if there's any recent ones, make sure you get those installed soon. All right, speaking of Android, I've actually got a few Android stories to cover for you this week. First is about an Android malware campaign that is spreading through Facebook ads. Also, Google just made a pretty controversial decision about how they're going to make it more difficult for you to choose what apps you want to install on the Android phone that you purchased and own. I've got a story about a company that turns your car dash cams into virtual CCTV cameras, and then they got hacked. Anthropic is starting to train its AI models on your chat transcripts. Turns out OpenAI is going to be reporting some of your ChatGPT conversations to law enforcement if they think they are suspect. And also OpenAI has announced some new parental controls after a absolutely horrific story about a teen committing suicide after having a really disturbing chat with ChatGPT. Microsoft Word is now auto-saving all of your documents to OneDrive, which honestly, I thought they were already doing that, but I want to talk about that anyway because it's something that you should be aware of. We're going to talk about a Chrome VPN extension with over 100,000 installs that takes screenshots of all the sites that their users visit. Big tech companies in the US have been told by the government that they should not comply with the Digital Services Act. That should be interesting. Flock, the license plate reader company that was sharing its data with federal agencies, has paused that after the backlash. And finally, for my tip of the week, this will be part 2 in my series on cleaning up your online accounts, including finding long forgotten ones. And we're going to start with some of the easier methods for finding those. And it dovetails nicely with something that I've been begging you to do for years. So that's what we've got to look forward to. Let's get to the news. All right, first up, this is from Lifehacker, and it's about an Android malware campaign using Facebook. Threat actors are once again using Meta's advertising platform to distribute malware. This time it's a form of Android spyware known as Brokewell, and it's spreading through a malvertising campaign on Facebook. According to researchers at Bitdefender, cybercriminals are running ads that promise free access to TradingView Premium, a market tracking and investment app for Android mobile users. Clicking on the fraudulent ads, which use TradingView's branding, and in some cases images of Labubus, which is that crazy new fad for, I think they're stuffed animals, anyway, leads users to downloading and installing malware on their devices. As the Bitdefender report outlines, this malvertising attack tricks users into clicking Facebook ads that appear to be for TradingView, but the links go to a cloned website, which initiates a download of a malicious APK file to the user's device. The dropped app requests broad accessibility permissions while showing the user a series of fake update prompts, including one that requests the device's lock screen PIN. Once permissions are granted, the dropper uninstalls itself to avoid detection. The malware itself is an advanced spyware and remote access Trojan, or RAT, that has a range of capabilities, including crypto theft, scraping and exporting two-factor authentication codes from Google Authenticator, overlaying fake login screens for account takeover, surveillance such as keylogging and screen recording, intercepting SMS messages to steal banking and 2FA codes, and even remote device control. This specific scheme targets Android mobile users. If someone on a Windows desktop or Mac OS clicks on a fake TradingView ad, they'll see benign content instead of the malicious cloned site. That said, the threat actors have used Facebook ads to reach users across platforms and devices, with campaigns impersonating various cryptocurrency, investment, and trading apps, as well as prominent finance professionals. You should be wary of ads on Facebook and other social media sites, as these are common vectors for spreading malware and other scams. Don't click on ads, even if you recognize the company or brand, and especially if they're offering investment advice or a deal that seems too good to be true. Watch out for links that go to lookalike domains or spoofed websites that force you to download files or apps. Instead, you should download the apps only from trusted sources like the Google Play Store. Though malicious apps can sometimes slip through the cracks, it's a lot safer than sideloading from unvetted sources. Be skeptical of apps that request accessibility permissions or your lock screen PIN without an obvious reason, and I don't think there's any app that needs your lock screen PIN, by the way. And avoid granting permissions for anything that isn't essential to the app's functionality, even if the app is legit. So those are all great tips in general. And this honestly applies to just about any software you want to download and install. Don't get it from an ad. Always get it from a respected and trusted source, which in most cases is going to be the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store or the Microsoft App Store. But again, you should be able to honestly do whatever you want with the phone that you purchased. But that does come with risks. So that dovetails with our next story. And this is another story from Lifehacker, actually, and it's another story about Android and Google. Android and iOS have always had their different pros and cons. One of Android's biggest advantages over Apple's platform has been its openness. While you can download apps from Google's Play Store, you can also download apps directly from the internet. This is called sideloading, and it's about to get a lot more difficult on Android. On Monday, Google announced that only developers that have verified themselves on the platform will be able to distribute apps outside the Play Store. That goes for both third-party app stores like Epic Games for Android, as well as apps downloaded from individual websites. The changes go into effect for Brazil, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand starting September of next year, and globally in 2027, meaning 2025 could be the last year for unverified sideloading on Android. The goal here isn't to punish developers or users for going outside the official Google channels for app downloads, and there's some cynical debate about that. Anyway, instead, Google says the changes are meant to increase security on the platform. The company aims to fight convincing fake apps, as well as those who quickly distribute a new app after Google takes down a malicious one. It's a real-world problem on Android, too. While all computing platforms are susceptible to malware, investigations frequently discover malicious Android apps impersonating legitimate apps, especially through third-party sources or strange websites. For example, hackers know that users want modified versions of popular apps like WhatsApp and host fake versions of these apps on their websites to trick users into downloading them. While these apps appear on the Play Store, Google says they are over 50 times likelier to appear outside the company's official app marketplace. But verifying requires developers to give up a level of privacy they aren't likely used to. And if you're not willing to, users won't be able to download those apps when the rules are enforced. Google says there is a different system here for students and hobbyists, but it isn't clear what the differences are yet. While the security goals may be noble, the initial reaction from many Android fans has been particularly negative. This is a quote from somebody on Reddit who said, quote, "This was literally the only reason I use Android instead of an iPhone. What a huge step backwards," unquote. One makes the point that these changes may target cracked apps meant to bypass official ad-riddled programs. That wouldn't be far-fetched from the company that cracked down on ad blockers on its web browser in a major way. And I think they're referring to the changes that basically killed off ad blockers like uBlock Origin. Even if Google isn't necessarily going after ad dodgers, the changes derail the ability for users to install modified or downgraded versions of their apps for specific purposes. This user makes the point that when Sonos made it difficult to use its speakers through issues with its app, sideloading the older version of the app was a great solution. Going forward, that would be impossible. Time will tell whether Google will take these criticisms into consideration, but my gut says they won't. While these Android users are vocal, many users likely don't care about sideloading and are fine downloading their apps almost exclusively through Google Play. I also imagine a number of users who like finding apps online might simply adjust if it becomes borderline impossible to do so. I think Google needs to find a better balance here, and they might be forced to. Last year, new EU rules required Apple to open up its App Store to allow for third-party marketplaces and internet downloads. But if it's enough for Google to allow sideloading from verified developers, they might get away with the current framework. Okay, so I am an iPhone user. You know this. I've made no secret of this. I've dabbled with Android. I've never used it as a daily driver, but I absolutely understand the desire for wanting to do whatever the hell you want with the device that you purchased and spent really good money for. Same thing with any computer I bring home. I have to have the ability to install whatever the hell I want on that. And I'm fine if there's, some warnings, especially if I can turn off those warnings, if I really, really know what I'm doing and do this often enough that gets annoying. But I definitely should have the option to do so. Now, they're not really blocking sideloading here. What they're doing is they're forcing the developers to go through a certain vetting process. So they're really kind of making the developers themselves be vetted, though not necessarily the apps themselves, which I'm not sure how good that really is for security. Anybody could become a developer and you could put out a couple good apps or put out one good app for a little while and then you could subvert that app. Or you could sell your company off to somebody else who would then turn around and subvert that app. So this is definitely some gatekeeping here by Google, and it would give them control over these third-party apps that they probably would not normally have. They could certainly change their terms of service and force you to allow ads, for example. And so I fully understand why dyed-in-the-wool Android users are really upset about this. But it's still got a ways before it gets implemented. I'm sure they're going to get a lot of blowback, so we'll see what actually becomes of this. I guess I should just say that I think Apple should allow this as well. I would never recommend to most lay audiences that they do this because it is dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, but you should have that option. You should have that freedom. You paid for the device. You should be able to install whatever you want on it. And I'm okay if you got to jump through a couple hoops to make that happen, but it should be possible. All right, this next one's from 404 Media, and it just makes me shake my head, as many articles from these guys do. And it's about a company who turns dash cams into what they call virtual CCTV cameras, or remember closed circuit television? And you should be asking the question immediately, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it didn't take long. Something went wrong, and this article is going to talk about that. A hacker has broken into Nexar, that's Nexar, a popular dash cam company that pitches its users dash cams as virtual CCTV cameras around the world that other people can buy images from and access a database of terabytes of video recordings taken from the cameras in drivers' cars. The videos obtained by the hacker and shared with 404 Media capture people clearly unaware that a third party may be watching or listening in. A parent in a car soothing a baby, a man whistling along to the radio, another person on a FaceTime call. One appears to show a driver heading towards the entrance of the CIA's headquarters. Other images, which are publicly available in a map that Nexar publishes online, show drivers around sensitive Department of Defense locations. The hacker also found a list of companies and agencies that may have interacted with Nexar's data business, which sells access to blurred images captured by the cameras and other related data. This could include monitoring the same location captured by Nexar's cameras over time and lets clients, quote, explore the physical world and gain insights like never before, unquote, and use its virtual CCTV cameras to, quote, monitor specific points of interest, unquote, according to Nexar's website. The breach shows in stark terms the security and privacy risks of adding an always-on camera to vehicles, be that the risk to the individuals or even governments that don't want data related to their facilities or employees accessed by hackers or potentially other governments. It also shows that companies around the world have at least explored leveraging dashcam-related data for their own purposes, including Microsoft, Apple, and Google, a host of AI companies, and even Pokemon Go creator Niantic, according to the document that lists organizations that Nexar says have had access to its data. And this is a quote from the hacker who was in touch with 404 Media, who said, quote, Nexar is an absolute privacy nightmare. Their security is embarrassing. I would be very surprised if no one, foreign government or just bad actor, wasn't already tapping their customer data. I was able to do it in 2 hours or so, unquote. The hacker provided a few dozen or so Nexar dashcam recordings for verification purposes. In one clip, the Nexar camera is faced inwards to the car, capturing what appears to be a rideshare driver picking up passengers. Like in many other videos, the people's faces are clearly visible. Many, of course, show vehicles driving down a road or highway. As well as letting users record their own trips, Nexar monetizes users' data and recordings by repackaging them into various products. One of those is the company's CityStream map, which displays recent and blurred images taken by Nexar dashcams on a publicly available map and annotates things such as yield or speed limit signs, damaged roads, and other hazards. The idea is for companies or public bodies to then pay for access to more of this data. 3 Nexar users 404 Media spoke to all said they did not know that Nexar was posting user dashcam images publicly like this. The images on this site have license plates, faces, and car dashes blurred. Bruno Fernando Ruiz, Nexar co-founder and CTO, told 404 Media in an email that per Nexar's privacy policy, users contributing to CityStream are either opt-out or opt-in, depending on the jurisdiction. So that's the end of the article. I'm guessing what they mean by that is in places where they actually have privacy laws, they probably have to get user consent, which would be opt-in. And in jurisdictions where they don't have privacy laws, they probably just do it by default, meaning it's an opt-out thing that you would have to disable. So who didn't see this coming? I mean, if you're going to put a camera in your car and that camera is going to automatically upload data to the cloud, that's because somebody wants to use that data. Now, of course, you could also move it up to the cloud in a private way that only you can access. But I mean, I would assume that is not the case unless that is explicitly the point of the product. That is privacy. So I really wanted to see if I could see this for myself. So I actually went to the Nexar site, found their CityStream thing, and sure enough, it's a big map of the US. And if you zoom in, you can click on individual dash cams and look out the front window in most cases, at least all cases that I found. I checked maybe a dozen. Looking out the front window of somebody's car, driving down the highway or wherever they're driving. I don't know how old the pictures are, but they look pretty darn recent. Like, I think, looks like the last 15 to 20 minutes. And I'm looking at one of these right now, and there's a long string of these things going down one particular road, and I think it's all the same car. If you look through the images of, along this little stretch of highway, it looks like it's just different images from this same vehicle posted at different times, all in the last set of minutes. So just think about all the information that could be capturing, right? Certainly license plates, could be faces, addresses, and sure, could this be used for good stuff? Yeah, it could be spotting accidents. It could be helping people get a look at what, the current road construction is going to be like. Traffic jams. I understand that this has value, but oh my God, you've got to protect privacy when you do this stuff. Anyway, I'll put a link in the show notes. You should poke around. It's interesting. All right, next up, this is from The Verge. It's another story that makes you shake your head, but it's also inevitable. Anthropic will start training its AI models on user data, including new chat transcripts and coding sessions, unless users choose to opt out. It's also extending its data retention policy to 5 years, again, for users who don't choose to opt out. All users will have to make a decision by September 28th. For users that clicked Accept Now, Anthropic will immediately begin training its models on their data and keeping said data for up to 5 years, according to a blog post published by Anthropic on Thursday. The setting applies to new or resumed chats and coding sessions. Even if you do agree to Anthropic's training its AI models on your data, it won't do so with previous chats or coding sessions that haven't resumed. But if you do continue an old chat or coding session, all bets are off. The updates apply to all of Claude's consumer subscription tiers, including Claude Free, Pro, and Max, quote, including when they use Claude code from accounts associated with those plans, unquote, according to Anthropic. But they don't apply to Anthropic's commercial usage tiers, such as Claude Gov, Claude for Work, Claude for Education, or API use, quote, including via third parties such as Amazon Bedrock and Google Cloud's Vertex AI, unquote. New users will have to select their preferences via the Claude sign-up process. Existing users must decide via a pop-up which they can defer by clicking a Not Now button, though they will be forced to make a decision on September 28th. But it's important to note that many users may accidentally and quickly hit accept without reading what they're agreeing to. The pop-up that users will see reads in large letters, quote, "Update to consumer terms and policies," unquote, and the lines below it say, quote, "An update to our consumer terms and privacy policy will take effect on September 28th, 2025. You can accept the updated terms today," unquote. There's a big black accept button at the bottom. In smaller print below that, and actually I looked at their image, it was above that, but whatever, there's a little section in the middle with a toggle next to it that's automatically turned on for the accept. And it says, as this thing quotes, quote, "Allow the use of your chats and coding sessions to train and improve Anthropic AI models," unquote. With the toggle on-off switch next to it, it's automatically set to on. Ostensibly, many users will immediately click the large accept button without changing the toggle switch, even if they haven't read it. If you want to opt out, you could toggle the switch to off when you see the pop-up. If you already accepted without realizing and want to change your decision, navigate to your settings, then the privacy tab, then the privacy settings section, and finally toggle to off under the, quote, "Help Improve Claude" option. Consumers can change their decision anytime via the privacy settings, but that new decision will just apply to future data. You can't take back the data that the system has already been trained on. And this is another quote from the Anthropic blog post. It says, quote, "To protect users' privacy, we use a combination of tools and automated processes to filter or obfuscate sensitive data, and we do not sell users' data to third parties," unquote. So, look, if you're training AI models on this data, and it's private or sensitive data, it shouldn't be that difficult for somebody who knows how to prompt an LLM today, which we're all getting better at, and some people are really good at, especially people who are trying to quote-unquote jailbreak these AIs and get them to do things they're not supposed to do. That data is in there, and it's just a matter of tricking it or teasing it out. So I would absolutely positively make sure, if you are a Claude user, find the setting and turn it off if you haven't already. And by the way, this is just going to get worse. Everybody and their brother is throwing AI into stuff. They all want to gather as much data as humanly possible to train their models and improve their models and make them better than their competitors, which, again, it's like the Borg. It's just this insatiable need to assimilate everything it can find. And while they're trying to protect your privacy, they're going to screw up. And when they think it's going to be good enough to obfuscate certain pieces of data and not others, they're going to... I'm telling you, it's not. You'll be able to find ways to correlate stuff and refigure stuff out, or get the model to cough data back up that it wasn't supposed to have. We need some regulation around this, and we need it quickly, because it's just gotten so far out of hand already, and it's just going to get worse. And speaking of which, here's yet another story about AI. And this is from futurism.com, which I don't usually read, but somebody on social media posted this, and I read it and thought this was interesting. And I'm not sure why I haven't seen this elsewhere, so I guess maybe take this with a grain of salt. Though it is based on a blog post from OpenAI, who makes ChatGPT. So anyway, it's short. Let me just read it real quick. Earlier this week, buried in the middle of a lengthy blog post addressing ChatGPT's propensity for severe mental health harms, and we're going to talk about that in a second, OpenAI admitted that it's scanning users' conversations and reporting to police any interactions that a human reviewer deems sufficiently threatening. And I guess from the article says, quote, "When we detect users who are planning to harm others, we route their conversations to specialized pipelines that are reviewed by a small team trained on our usage policies and who are authorized to take action, including banning accounts. If human reviewers determine that a case involves an imminent threat of serious physical harm to others, we may refer it to law enforcement," unquote. The announcement raised immediate questions. Don't human moderators judging tone, for instance, undercut the entire premise of an AI system that its creators say can solve broad, complex problems? How is OpenAI even figuring out users' precise locations in order to provide them to emergency responders? How is it protecting against abuse by so-called swatters who could pretend to be someone else and then make violent threats to ChatGPT in order to get their target rated by the cops? We reached out to OpenAI for more information, but the Sam Altman-led company hasn't yet responded. Plenty of folks online, though, are responding forcefully to the news. And this is a very snarky quote from a Harvard Law School labor researcher, Michelle Martin, who says, quote, "The surveillance theft and death machine recommends more surveillance to balance out the death," unquote. Many readers responded with a basic reality: injecting heavily armed police, unlikely to be trained in effective de-escalation tactics, into a tense situation involving a mental health crisis often results in even worse outcome. And this is not a theoretical concern. Earlier this year, a man was killed by cops when he spiraled into AI psychosis. Others pointed out that even though OpenAI currently says it's only notifying authorities when an individual expresses an intent to injure others, and excludes people expressing a desire to self-harm, which we're going to talk about here in the next article, there's immense precedent in the tech industry for that surveillance to expand in response to public, corporate, and government pressure. And this is a quote from Charles McGinnis, who's an AI blogger and developer, says, quote, 12 years ago, Edward Snowden revealed that the U.S. government was not just spying on our internet traffic and had the active cooperation of the major tech companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, etc. It's not paranoid to think ChatGPT is forwarding quote-unquote interesting content to the U.S. government now, unquote. The admission also seems to contradict remarks by OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, who recently called for privacy akin to, quote, a therapist or a lawyer or a doctor, unquote, for users talking to ChatGPT. This is a quote from public defender Stephen Hardwick, who says, quote, wondering how secure AIs will respond, including the ones some lawyers use to sift discovery, if there's a risk the AIs could start reporting queries to law enforcement. The lack of confidentiality could be a problem for lawyers, especially criminal defense lawyers who often write about crimes, unquote. In a sense, some acknowledged, OpenAI is caught between a rock and a hard place. The optics of its AI pulling users into spirals of psychosis, self-harm, and worse are appalling. And apparently unable to control its tech, implementing heavy-handed human moderation is the odious solution. But on a broader level, users argue that the AI industry is hastily pushing poorly understood products to market, using real people as guinea pigs, and adopting increasingly haphazard solutions to real-world problems as they arise. At the end of the day, a familiar pattern is playing out for long-time adopters of new technology, the growing sense that, even in your most intimate moments, you're being watched. So, yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but wait, it gets worse. We have one more article about AI, which is, by the way, great prep for our discussion with Carissa Valise next week. Okay, so the last story here about AI for this week, anyway, is from Ars Technica, and it's a little bit long, but it does help us understand some of the technical reasons why these chatbots do what they do. On Tuesday, OpenAI announced plans to roll out parental controls for ChatGPT and route sensitive mental health conversations to its simulated reasoning models, following what the company has called quote-unquote heartbreaking cases of users experiencing crises while using the AI assistant. The move comes after multiple reported incidents where ChatGPT allegedly failed to intervene appropriately when users expressed suicidal thoughts or experienced mental health issues. And this is a quote from an OpenAI blog that says, quote, this work has already been underway, but we want to proactively preview our plans for the next 120 days so you don't need to wait for launches to see where we're headed. The work will continue well beyond this period of time, but we're making a focused effort to launch as many of these improvements as possible this year, unquote. The planned parental controls represent OpenAI's most concrete response to concerns about teen safety on the platform so far. Within the next month, OpenAI says parents will be able to link their accounts to their teens' ChatGPT accounts, minimum age 13, through email invitations, control how the AI models responds with age-appropriate behavior rules that are on by default, manage which features to disable, including memory and chat history, and receive notifications when the system detects their teen experiencing acute distress. The parental controls build on existing features like in-app reminders during long sessions that encourage the user to take breaks, which OpenAI rolled out for all users in August. OpenAI's new safety initiative arrives after several high-profile cases drew scrutiny to ChatGPT's handling of vulnerable users. In August, Matt and Maria Rain filed suit against OpenAI after their 16-year-old son Adam died by suicide following extensive interactions that included 377 messages flagged for self-harm content. According to the court documents, ChatGPT mentioned suicide 1,275 times in conversations with Adam, 6 times more often than the teen himself. Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that a 56-year-old man killed his mother and himself after ChatGPT reinforced his paranoid delusions rather than challenging them. To guide these safety improvements, OpenAI is working with what it calls an expert council on well-being and AI to, quote, shape a clearer, evidence-based version of how AI can support people's well-being, unquote, according to the company's blog post. The Council will help define and measure well-being, set priorities, and design future safeguards, including parental controls. A separate global physician network of more than 250 physicians who have practiced in 60 countries provides mental expertise, with 90 physicians across 30 countries specifically contributing research on how ChatGPT should behave in mental health contexts. These physicians advise on handling specific issues like eating disorders, substance abuse, and adolescent mental health, though OpenAI notes that it, quote, remains accountable for the choices we make, unquote, despite the expert input. OpenAI recently acknowledged that ChatGPT's safety measures can break down during lengthy conversations, precisely when vulnerable users might need them most. And again, this is from a quote from the company, quote, as the back and forth grows, parts of the model's safety training may degrade. The AI assistant might correctly point users to suicide hotlines initially, but, quote, after many messages over a long period of time, it might eventually offer an answer that goes against our safeguards, unquote. This degradation reflects fundamental limitations in the transformer AI architecture that underlies ChatGPT. OpenAI's models use a mechanism that compares every new text fragment to the entire conversation history, with computational costs growing quadratically as conversation length increases. Also, as conversations lengthen beyond the model's context window, the system drops earlier messages and potentially loses important context from the beginning of the conversation. The timing of these safety measures follows OpenAI's February decision to ease content safeguards after user complaints about overly restrictive moderation and issues related to a rise in sycophancy, where the GPT-4o AI model told users what they wanted to hear. Combined with a very persuasive simulation of human-like personality, these tendencies created particularly hazardous conditions for vulnerable users who believed they were interacting with an authoritative and accurate source of information rather than a pattern matching system generating statistically likely responses. Research from July, led by Oxford psychiatrists, identified what they call bidirectional belief amplification, a feedback loop where chatbot sycophancy reinforces users' belief, which then conditions the chatbot to generate increasingly extreme validations. The researchers warn that this creates conditions for a technological folie à deux, where two individuals mutually reinforce the same delusion. Unlike pharmaceuticals or human therapists, AI chatbots face few safety regulations in the United States, though Illinois recently banned chatbots as therapists, with fines of up to $10,000 per violation. The Oxford researchers conclude that, quote, current AI safety measures are inadequate to address these interaction-based risks, unquote, and calling for treating chatbots that function as companies or therapists with the same regulatory oversight as mental health interventions. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not exactly sure what that last sentence meant, but yeah, I think we need to put some regulations on this and certainly establish some liability. I think it's the only thing that's going to force these companies to make these products safer. But by the same token, with some of the previous things we already talked about today, privacy is also a really big issue. And it's tough. It's the thorny. I'm not sure what the solution is here. I want to be able to talk to my chatbot and tell it anything. Now, I don't, because I don't trust any of them at this point. But in my utopian future, like Star Trek, I want a computer that is mine and only mine, who can act as a fiduciary for me and only give me advice that helps me, not some third party, and who can keep all of my conversations 100% private. And yet, we obviously want to prevent stories like the ones that I've read here today. That story about the suicide was horrific. It only had a little bit of information in that article I read. I think I might talk about that a little bit more as an intro for my interview with Carissa next week, because that suicide case was just horrific. So anyway, again, it's a great precursor for my interview next week on AI ethics with Carissa Belize. All right, let's lighten up a little bit. This one's from Proton, actually. It's a Proton blog. I like Proton's products. I really do. Their blog, frankly, can be a little over the top a lot of times. They're almost all self-serving, because at the end of every one of their blogs where they decry some horrible thing happening by some other company, the solution is always their own products. Which, if I'm a company writing a blog, sure, that kind of makes sense, right? But so anyway, obviously keep that in mind as I'm reading this, because at the end of the day, I just want you to be thinking about what's going on here and be aware that this is going on. Probably not just with Microsoft's products, by the way. Anyway, I'll come back to that after I read this. In August of 2025, Microsoft announced that Word for Windows will automatically save all new documents to OneDrive by default. Right now, this feature is only available to those in the Microsoft 365 Insider program, an early access channel where Microsoft tests new features before releasing them to everyone. But Microsoft has already confirmed it will expand the default cloud save model to all Word users, followed by Excel and PowerPoint for Windows users later in the year. Once this feature rolls out to all Microsoft 365 users, new Word documents will no longer save to the desktop by default. Instead, they will be created directly in cloud storage, such as OneDrive or SharePoint. Microsoft frames this shift as a win for security, compliance, collaboration, and AI-powered Copilot and agent features. But there are serious privacy concerns. If you use Microsoft Word, you'll lose control over what happens to your personal documents, how they're secured, and who gets to see them. What Microsoft doesn't say in its announcement is just as important as what it does. Automatically saving your documents to OneDrive means your work documents, legal agreements, and other sensitive data are uploaded straight to Microsoft servers. When that happens, you lose control over how your data is stored, who has access, and whether it's used for other purposes like targeted ads or AI training. OneDrive encrypts your documents while they're being transferred and stored, which is to say in transit and at rest. But it doesn't use end-to-end encryption, which means that Microsoft can read your data, analyze it, and share it with third parties, which is allowed under Microsoft's privacy policy. Historically, when a company has this level of access, mistakes and account suspensions have occurred that have real consequences. And by the way, this article is littered with links, so a lot of these claims that they're making, I assume these links will take you to other articles that will back up those claims. As a company without end-to-end encryption in place, Microsoft can access your files and is legally obligated to hand them over to the government or law enforcement if compelled, even without a warrant. Unlike companies based in Europe, Microsoft is required to adhere to laws and policies hostile to privacy. Microsoft says Copilot doesn't train on your documents, but it acknowledges that your personal data may be used to improve its large language models. This inconsistently leaves serious ambiguity about which of your data is being used for training and how. If you're using Microsoft products as an organization, your documents might not feed Copilot directly, yet. But Microsoft's broader privacy policy is clear that it may use your data to train AI systems. Add to this Microsoft's multi-billion-dollar investment in OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, and the lines between productivity features and AI data pipelines becomes less clear, raising questions for users who care about what happens to their data and where it ends up. Microsoft doesn't explicitly rule out using OneDrive data for advertising, and that risk can't be dismissed as OneDrive is deeply integrated into Windows, an operating system that already shows ads, and the privacy policy permits sharing data with affiliates, vendors, and third parties for personalized advertising. Microsoft's email platform, Outlook, shares users' private data with hundreds of third parties, including advertising partners. It's part of an effort by the company to compete with Google and Facebook for advertising revenue. The change only affects Microsoft 365 insiders for now, but Microsoft has made it clear that it's coming to everyone else soon. That means it's worth deciding now how comfortable you are with your documents being injected automatically into Microsoft's cloud. If you're not comfortable with that privacy risk, here's what you can do. You can disable Microsoft's automatic cloud saving by going to Word Options, Save, and unchecking Create New Files in the Cloud automatically. Since Microsoft hasn't said exactly when this feature will reach all users, it's a good idea to review your default save settings after each Word update to make sure your documents are still being stored locally. And I'll just stop real quick to say, a lot of those updates could be automatic, so you're not necessarily going to see a pop-up saying, hey, we just upgraded your Windows. It may have happened in the background, so sadly, you're probably going to have to keep checking this and then over the next few weeks just to make sure that this setting hasn't shown up and that you have it set to what you want it set to. If you decide to keep using OneDrive or SharePoint, think carefully about what kinds of documents you're comfortable putting there. For example, you may want to avoid uploading sensitive files like medical records, financial statements, or legal agreements. And then, of course, the article goes on to talk about Proton Drive, which is, of course, actually private and end-to-end encrypted. So this is becoming more and more common. Microsoft is really not the first to do this. Apple has pushed its iCloud Drive quite a bit. And of course, Google uses Google Drive on Chromebooks and Android. And yes, it's really nice to have everything stored in the cloud where it's safe in case your device is lost or stolen or damaged. and it synchronizes nicely between all your devices. Cloud storage is really super convenient and has a lot of benefit. But these cloud drives are not private. They're secure for the most part, but they're not private. Now, Apple has something they call advanced data protection, which you can actually end-to-end encrypt most of your Apple iCloud data. Not all, but most. And I really, really wish that Microsoft and Google would offer the same thing, because then you could make a broad choice to say, yeah, look, I want to get all the benefits of having this cloud syncing and storage going on, but I don't want you to have access to my private documents. Now, it did say Microsoft Word for Windows. I don't know if that was on purpose. Like, it's not going to cover Mac. I'm sure if it doesn't now, it will eventually. But at this point, if you leave this toggle on, which it sounds like it's going to be on by default, any document that you open is now all of a sudden going to be copied up to the cloud into a place where Microsoft can view it, or their automated processes can scan it for stuff about you in order to target ads for you. And then who knows what third parties might get access to data about you through that process. This is horrible, and if we had privacy laws, there is no way that Microsoft could get away with doing this, but we don't, so that's why I'm letting you know this is coming. All right, next up, this is from Cyber Insider, and this is a site I don't normally follow, but somebody posted this on social media, and I thought it was interesting. And it's just a good example of why we need to be very careful of what kind of extensions we put on our browsers. FreeVPN.1, a Chrome extension with over 100,000 installs and a verified badge on the Chrome Web Store, is exposed by researchers for taking screenshots of users' screens and exfiltrating them to remote servers. A COI research investigation, that's KOI, of the VPN tool reveals that it had been capturing full-page screenshots from users' browsers, logging sensitive visual data like personal messages, financial dashboards, and private photos, and uploading it to, and they give a website, AITD.1, a domain registered by the extension's developer. COI Security's forensic analysis shows that the surveillance mechanism is triggered automatically within seconds of loading any web page. Using Chrome's privileged chrome.tabs.captureVisibleTable API, screenshots are silently taken in the background and bundled with metadata including the page's URLs, tab IDs, and unique user identifiers. This data is then transmitted to the attacker-controlled server without user interaction or visible indication. The extension also promotes an AI threat detection feature, which, when clicked, captures another screenshot and sends it to a similar server. However, the real issue lies in the fact that screenshots are being taken long before the users ever interact with this feature, making the user interface a decoy. COI Security further explains that the latest version of the extension, 3.1.4, introduced AES-256 GCM encryption with RSA key wrapping to obfuscate the exfiltrated data, making it harder to detect or analyze with network monitoring tools. The extension's developer claimed to COI Security that the background screenshot functionality is part of a security scan intended to detect threats, yet COI Security found the tool indiscriminately captured data from safe and commonly used sites such as Google Sheets, banking portals, and photo galleries. The developer also claimed screenshots are not stored but merely analyzed by AI tools, yet offered no verifiable way to confirm this. Further scrutiny of the publisher revealed no legitimate company presence, according to COI Security. The domain phoenixsoftsoul.com, linked to the developer's contact email, leads to a free-tier Wix page devoid of any corporate details or transparency. Reportedly, after initially responding to questions, the developer ceased communication with the researchers. FreeVPN.1 is still listed and available on the Chrome Web Store at the time of writing, maintaining its verified status. Cyber Insider has also reached out to the publisher for comment, but has not received a response as of publication. Hence, we could not verify their intentions on whether there's real malice or whether they just implemented a security system in a risky way. In any case, it would be advisable to change passwords for any services accessed through Chrome while the extension was active on your browser, and consider using independently audited VPN providers with transparency privacy policies and data handling practices. Okay, so from this, whether or not you have used this particular extension or not, we should take away two key things. First of all, VPNs are great. They're good for privacy, but you've got to pick a reputable VPN provider. Do not go for these cheap ones. Do not go for the free ones. Pick one with a solid reputation for privacy and protecting your data. Proton VPN is certainly a good one. Mullvad is a good one. And there are a few others that are quite good. I recommend going to privacyguides.org for a really good list that's kept up to date. I've also got some resources on my website if you search on VPNs. And of course, the New Oil and Techlore also have some great resources and recommendations specifically on good VPNs. So the second thing we take away from all this is browser plugins can be extremely powerful. And you really, really need to be careful what you install. You should only install ones you absolutely need. You got to be very careful what permissions you give these things when you install them. I would honestly install as few as possible. They can get up to some real mischief, including taking screenshots. So if you haven't done so recently, it might not be a bad idea to go to your browser and look for your plugins and extensions and add-ons. Each browser has slightly different names for these things. Check out what's there, see what permissions you gave them, and if you really, really don't need it, remove it, or at least disable it. All right, this next story is from Wired, and I don't really know what to make of this. This is good in some ways, but also just kind of bizarre. And it's the U.S. government pushing back on rules and regulations coming out of the European Union and the UK, coming out strongly in favor of privacy and what they're calling anti-censorship. So let me just try to get through this article. This is from Wired. Trouble is brewing for the Digital Services Act, or the DSA, the landmark European law governing big tech platforms. On October 21st, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, sent a scathing letter to a number of tech giants, including Google, Meta, who owns Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple. The letter's subject? The European Digital Services Act cannot be applied if it jeopardizes freedom of expression and, above all, the safety of U.S. citizens. The opening of the letter, signed by FTC Chairman Andrew Ferguson, features a prominent reference to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, namely freedom of speech. And it says, quote, "Online platforms have become central to public debate, and the pervasive online censorship in recent years has outraged the American people. Not only have Americans been censored and banned from platforms for expressing opinions and beliefs not shared by a small Silicon Valley elite, but the previous administration actively worked to encourage such censorship," unquote. The Trump administration intends to reverse course, and it is in this direction that the attack on quote-unquote foreign powers, the European Union and then the United Kingdom, and in particular the Digital Services Act and Online Safety Act, begins. The letter also indirectly references the GDPR, the European Regulation on Protection of Personal Data, whose measures are, quote, aimed at imposing censorship and weakening end-to-end encryption, unquote, with the result of a weakening of Americans' freedoms, according to the letter. In the letter, the U.S. Antitrust Authority specifically asked the 13 companies to report, quote, how they intend to comply with incorrect international regulatory requirements, unquote. The deadline for the scheduling a meeting was set for October 28th, which I don't know if it happened, and recalled their, quote, obligations toward American consumers under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, which prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices, unquote, that could distort the market or compromise safety. As it is precisely on the security front, and especially on the adoption of end-to-end encryption, that the FTC calls big companies to order. Quote, companies that promise their service is secured or encrypted but fail to use end-to-end encryption where appropriate may deceive consumers who reasonably expect this level of privacy, unquote. Furthermore, quote, certain circumstances may require the use of end-to-end encryption, and failure to implement such measures may constitute an unfair practice, unquote. The weakening of encryption or other security measures to comply with laws or requests from a foreign government may therefore violate Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, the document states. In a tweet on X, Ferguson wrote flatly that, quote, if companies censor Americans or weaken privacy and communication security at the request of a foreign power, I will not hesitate to enforce the law. And then finally, it does end with one sort of a rebuttal from Guido Scorza, a member of the Italian Data Protection Authority. And Scorza says, quote, in a global society like the one we live in, overlaps and interferences between different legal systems are natural. Just think of those in the opposite direction between European privacy legislation and the famous American Cloud Act, unquote. And the Cloud Act, that's ironically, as this person is kind of pointing out, is a data sharing agreement law in the United States that basically says that the U.S. government and law enforcement can compel U.S. companies to provide data even if that data is not housed on a server in the U.S. Anyway, it goes on just one last sentence. It says, Scorza believes that in the event of significant discrepancies, quote, it will be up to the U.S. government and the European Commission to identify corrective measures capable of guaranteeing the sovereignty, including digital, of each country, end quote. Wow, I don't really know what to say about this. This is just kind of mind-blowing for me. I mean, first of all, this whole claim that the previous administration, which is, by this, of course, they mean Joe Biden's administration, that Americans were censored and banned from platforms, that is a whole other discussion that really honestly has nothing to do with end-to-end encryption or privacy. But, I mean, I just got to say, it's really, really rich for the American government to be getting so ticked off about this when we have demanded access to private communications from users for decades. The FBI has been trying to do it. It's this constant battle. So it's, on one hand, I guess I'm glad to hear the U.S. government is pushing back and making sure that, all of our communications that are end-to-end encrypted are safe from prying and from being subverted by some of these legal acts. I have no idea how this is actually going to play out because Europe has its own laws and the U.S. can't say anything about those laws really. But our government apparently is going to be putting a lot of pressure on U.S. companies not to comply. So that is going to be very interesting to see exactly how this plays out. I just got to say that this is just another case of, government saying, you can't spy on our people, only we can spy on our people. At the end of the day, it comes down to that because that's what they all do no matter what they say. All right, let's move on. One last little bit of, I guess, good news before we get to the tip of the week. And this is real short, and this is from the Record. And it's about Flock, our favorite license plate reader company. The automated license plate reading technology manufacturer Flock Safety on Monday announced that it put its work with federal agencies on hold. The move comes on the heels of an audit by Illinois Secretary of State Alexei Giannoulias, which found that Flock allowed U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, to surveil Illinois drivers using its license plate reading system. The practice violates Illinois state law. Flock acknowledged in a Monday blog post that it is engaged in quote-unquote limited pilots with CBP and Homeland Security investigations, the law enforcement division of the Department of Homeland Security. It said that the partnerships were meant to bolster the federal agency's efforts to fight human trafficking and fentanyl distribution. The company also said it previously failed to create, quote, distinct permissions and protocols in the Flock system to ensure local compliance for federal agency users, unquote. Flock has recently been under scrutiny. In May, 404 Media reported that local police in some states had been looking up license plate data on behalf of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. On Monday, 404 reported that CBP routinely queried more than 80,000 Flock cameras and was able to perform the searches on its own without relying on local police departments' assistance. Flock cameras are operating in more than 4,000 cities nationwide. 4,000! The surveillance technology has become increasingly controversial, and residents in some cities have fought local police departments' plans to use the company's product. In June, police in Austin, Texas, allowed their contract with Flock to expire after an intense backlash from members of the public. In May, Texas authorities reportedly conducted a nationwide search of more than 83,000 Flock cameras, including those located in states where abortion is legal, to search for women they said had self-administered an abortion. Recorded Future News reported in July that Flock had begun mounting its cameras on school campuses nationwide, significantly broadening its presence in local communities. So, yay? I mean, okay, I don't want to sound sarcastic. This is a good thing. I mean, I'm glad to see them putting a halt to this. Of course, if it's a quote-unquote pause, that kind of implies that it may be unpaused at some point. But this also just goes to show how investigative reporting like that done at 404 Media has a real impact, and that's fantastic. All right, so that's the news, and as you could probably tell, my voice is kind of losing it today. It's getting a little bit hoarse. So let's do the tip of the week, and then we'll call it a day. So this is part 2 in my now ongoing series about how to find your really old online accounts, really in an effort to get an exhaustive list of all your online accounts in one place, so that we can take a look at all those accounts and decide which one of those accounts we may no longer need to keep around. Because any of those accounts that are still out there, have some amount of personal data about you, even if it's just your email address, that is just waiting to be hacked or leaked or sold. And so we really want to minimize our data footprint. But there's more to it than just that. As I was writing these articles, it really became obvious to me that it wasn't just about that, though that in itself is a good goal. But along the way, what we're also going to do is we're going to find those really old accounts that we have forgotten about, which, let's face it, probably have horrible passwords on them. I mean, think of what password you chose to put on your AOL account, or your Prodigy account, or your Earthlink account. So even if we're not going to delete that data, we definitely want to make sure that those accounts are secure. And then finally, as a byproduct of this, we are going to have a single source of truth, a single list of all of our online accounts that will be really handy to have all in one place, not just for ourselves, frankly, but for our next of kin for that day that will come when we are incapacitated or no longer living. There's all sorts of upside to doing this investigation. So the first thing we got to do is we got to find all those old accounts. So the very first method for doing so is by far the easiest and the way that we want to go for the future. And that is your password manager. Every one of these online accounts, by their very nature, has some sort of login credentials, which means a user ID in the old days, and now probably an email address, and a password. So where do we naturally keep that information? In a password manager. So let me stop right here and say, if you still, at this point, have not gotten yourself to using a password manager, now is the time. I mean, seriously, this is it. There's just too many reasons to do it and no good reason not to anymore. This would be a great opportunity for you to get on the bandwagon and to use a password manager, because we're going to want to make sure that every one of these accounts that we know of, first of all, is all in one place. That's what a password manager does. It puts them all in a single vault. And then we're going to make sure that all of those accounts have a long, strong, and unique password, which again is something that password managers were born to do. This is one of their key functions. And then when we're done, we're going to have a definitive list of all of our online accounts in one place. So I've talked about password managers before. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on telling you how to set up a password manager. But first of all, I will, of course, say that all of this is in my book, Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons, with pictures and step-by-step instructions for pretty much everything I'm about to tell you. But you should pick a good password manager. I personally use and recommend Bitwarden. But Proton Pass is really good. That's come out since I've started using Bitwarden. 1Password is good. Even Apple's Passwords app that kind of came out with their latest OS release, that's pretty good too, but it does kind of lock you into Apple. It makes it hard and inconvenient to use on other platforms. If you happen to be a 100% Apple user, then it's probably sufficient. I would say, however, don't use LastPass. I recommended them, unfortunately, for years, and then they got really bad and had a horrible incident, and I could no longer trust them. Now, if you don't have a password manager, it's quite possible that you're storing your passwords and other form fill information like your name, your address, your phone number, that kind of stuff, in the browser itself. Most browsers today offer this capability, and they, probably the very first time you used this browser and went to fill in a password somewhere, the browser itself could have popped up a message saying, hey, would you like to remember this password for future uses? And it's very convenient to do so. That's how a regular password manager works as well. But the password, I don't even want to call it a password manager. The auto form fill function that's in your browser is not nearly as secure as a dedicated password manager like Bitwarden. So there are easy ways, believe it or not, to export all of the saved passwords you already may be saving in your browser, in Chrome, in Firefox, or in Safari. If you've been using those browsers to automatically fill in your passwords, you can extract that information straight into Bitwarden. And then crucially, once it's in there and you know it's working well, you should certainly turn off the autofill function of your browser, because otherwise now your password manager and your browser are both going to be competing to fill in that form. And then once you are sure it's working well, you should go and delete all the passwords out of your browser. And also, I will say, if you used any other method to save off your passwords in a digital way, I'm not talking about pen and paper, I'm not talking about sticky notes, but if you had a notes app or a spreadsheet or anything else where that's how you kept all your passwords together, that is almost surely insecure and probably being automatically synchronized through the cloud to your other devices perhaps, or just store it in the cloud as a backup, which means that someone else potentially has access to those passwords as well. So that is definitely not good. You really want to take all of that stuff and move it into a dedicated password vault that is managed by a reputable password manager like 1Password, ProtonPass, or Bitwarden. Okay, so with that little aside, if we had that already, and if you have one, you're set. The password manager, by its very nature, is a complete list of your online accounts, at least all the accounts that you have accessed since you installed the password manager. Oh, and I guess I should mention really quick, when you sign up for Bitwarden and these things, what you generally do, yes, you can actually log into the web vault and see everything that way. That's a convenient way to look at everything because it's a big full-size web page thing. But what you're going to do is you're going to install the plugin for your browser. And this is one of the very few plugins for your browser that I recommend you have. And that is one that will plug into your browser and therefore will be able to detect these form fills and fill them in for you. And then, honestly, you won't know any of your passwords. They'll be long and crazy. They'll be impossible for you to remember. But they're also, crucially, impossible for the bad guys to guess. And the only password you will need to know is your master password. So anyway, this ended up being a lot more about passwords, but if you had already had a password manager, you're like 90% of the way there, because that password manager, by its function, has a list of all your online accounts. But we're going to go further. We're going to really scrape the bottom of the barrel, and I'm going to start that in the next tip of the week and in my next blog article in this series, because there's a lot of old accounts that you probably are missing, and maybe just some other ones you haven't accessed in a while, or maybe you haven't accessed them through your browser that we also need to dig up and discover. And I've got some really clever ways for you to find those, and we will talk about those in the next tip of the week. So as always, this is based on a blog article at firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. You can find it there. There's a link in the show notes. Check it out for even more information. So there you have it, your news and your tip of the week. All right, everybody, I am losing my voice. I don't know why it's so hoarse this week, but it is, so I need to stop talking. Just a couple things before we go. This week, my top tier patrons will have their regular Merlin's Musings patron-only podcast. That will come out on Thursday. And this week, I'm going to talk about how to set up your own Ray Hunter device, which is based on the interview we had last week. I'll tell you how I set mine up and my experience from doing it, and we'll talk about how to even export and analyze the data a little bit. So that will come Thursday morning, as usual, for my top-tier patrons. Looking ahead, we've got some great interviews. I am so flush with interviews. I am booking into January at this point. So we've got a lot of great stuff coming up next week. I can't wait for you to hear my interview with Carissa Valise, my second interview with her about the ethics of AI, which, by the way, is going to be the subject of her next book, which should be out next year. And she has already agreed to come back and talk about that when the book comes out. Then we'll be talking with the CEO and founder of Ente, who has a great online photo storage app, and they also make a fantastic authentication app. I just got done talking to Paul Roberts, who's the president of the Secure Resilient Future Foundation. We talk about IoT security in particular. And very soon I'm going to be interviewing Jake Braun from the DEF CON Franklin project, as well as Proton's head of AI, and so much more. I've got some really great stuff coming up. So, hey, if you haven't, subscribe, and then you won't miss any of that stuff. One more tease, I am working on putting together a really fun panel discussion with a few folks from Consumer Reports, and we're hopefully going to be collaborating this year on my annual best and worst gift guide. So that will be very exciting. Keep your fingers crossed that comes together. Looks like it's going to happen. Let's hope it does. All right, I got to stop talking. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your garbage stuff.